ancient warriors, prophets, kings, politics, conspiracies. No, this is just thousands of years of truth and history. It's the Word of God. And I'm Wade.
And I'm Jenn.
And join us as we add oil to our lamps, learning from and applying the Holy Scripture to our lives. As we set out in a dark world and uncover the things that want to remain hidden by shining the light of Christ. Awake, O sleeper. This is Out of the Darkness. Hey everyone, we have another addition to Discovering the Saints. And this show will be part one of a two-part show where we're joined by Tiffany, who has an incredible background. We talk her testimony, her over 2 decades of martial arts, and her times as a martial arts instructor, and how that reacted with her faith. And if that's not fascinating enough, she's got a Ph.D. in Geology, which is the field she currently works in, all up in the great north of Canada. That's right, you know what I'm talking about. Let's take care of that Timmy's Run by strapping in and coming along for the ride as we discover the saints. And so, on the show, on this portion of Discovering the Saints, we've got Tiffany up in Canada, the Great North. Tiffany, how are you doing?
I'm doing really good today, thank you. How are you guys?
I'm doing good.
We're doing pretty good over here, down south, I guess, here in the States. But, I've been really fascinated with your background. I thought how important it is for people out there, the remnant, the body, the believers, because there's a lot of people out there who are separated, and there's a lot of people that I think are isolated. And, I mean, in the last Discovering the Saints, I kind of went over a depression I was going through. And the area that we live in, is hostile to Christianity. And just the dreariness I felt, and the weather reflected that. But all of a sudden, just out of in my depression as I was outside, there was this little hint of something I was hearing. I was listening, and I was like, what is that? Some music going on in the background, and it was I recognized it. I'm like, oh, it's Christian music. And like, I don't know who I think. I don't even know. I can't even I just knew it was Christian music. And I was like, wow. And it was coming across from an apartment complex across the street. And I was like, wow. And someone had their windows open and they were blaring Christian music. It's like, wow. And it took me back to that Elijah, as he's out in the wilderness and he's complaining to God, like, they've all turned against you. They've all turned against you, and there's no one else serving you. It's just me here. And God tells Elijah, I've got thousands of others who haven't bowed their knee to Baal that you don't even know about. And that's part of this series is here, that we're kind of uncovering, people out there and trying to connect us all together, whether it be through podcasts, whether it be through the computer. But I just want to encourage people out there who maybe feel alone, and to know that there's plenty of other people who haven't bowed their knee to Baal. And something with you, Tiffany, I thought was really interesting, especially given your background. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I live in Canada, up north in the snow and the cold, with the igloos and the dog sleds. And my background, I guess to start off with, my family, I come from a Christian mother and a father atheist. So that's sort of my background. So my mother was the source of our Christian upbringing growing up. And my mother and I are the last of our family to sort of remain Christian. So my siblings have largely fallen away, I would say, from the faith. My husband is also, I would say, an agnostic. So he is not a Christian. And my daughter is a Christian, so that's a blessing. And so having Christian friends and Christian fellowship, both within the church and also throughout North America, like you guys also in the States, has been really important for my faith, to help it grow. So it's a really big blessing to be able to talk to you guys today. So I've been a Christian for pretty much my whole life. But I was involved when I was 9. I started doing martial arts. So I did martial arts probably for, I would say, 25 years. So I got my 3rd degree black belt. I was an instructor at the school. That's where my husband and I met. So I was involved in that in quite a few years. And I ended up leaving that probably about 5 years ago, I want to say. It got to the point where I couldn't reconcile what we were doing with my faith. So before that, I sort of had compartmentalized myself in that I was a Christian, but, at the Kung Fu studio, I was, a Kung Fu instructor and still a Christian, but there was sort of that divide between living your faith. You had a different persona when you were there. But eventually it got to the point where I had to reconcile the beliefs that I was professing as a Christian versus sort of the beliefs I was supporting, not necessarily professing, but supporting at the Kung Fu school. So I left there and my husband left there and we stopped instructing. I'm also a geologist, so I have my Ph.D. in geology. I've taught at universities before, and I work as a geologist currently. And so my experience on that front has been largely sort of finding out a lot of the things that people say disprove the Christian faith aren't necessarily true. And so going through the sciences has actually strengthened my faith quite a bit. And even though the majority of the people I work with and have gone to school with in my career are atheists, many of them very adamantly so, there has been nothing thus far that has shaken my faith. And in fact, it's been strengthening to look into a lot of the issues, in regards to evolution or, deep time, things like that. And finding out that there's really nothing of substance to challenge the Bible or biblical truths. And I think that's one of the things I've tried to do thus far, at least with my friends, is sort of tell them that science does not disprove the Bible. It does not disprove Christianity. And you can be a scientist and still be a Christian, and a Bible-believing Christian at that. You don't have to sacrifice your faith to conduct science. That said, there are lots that hold some scientific theories as dogma, but people have to understand that requires just the same amount of faith to believe in evolution per se as it does to believe in Christianity. So I think that's something I'm trying to contribute, at least in a small way, to the Christian community and especially to my colleagues, getting them to question some of the dogma a little bit. So yeah, that's my background in a nutshell, I guess.
That is fascinating. And so, yeah, you were saying a lot of interesting things there. If we go back, you're talking about, so your mother was the Christian in the family. And so that was just something that was a part of your life, of your upbringing, or was there a time of like conversion? I mean, how much of an influence did your father have? Obviously, your mother had the greater influence in the outcome, but growing up, what was that? What was that like?
Well, my father always respected people having faith, but he viewed it as a bit of a crutch. And so he didn't mind the idea of us being brought up in sort of a religious framework. And he supported it because he thought it would give us some emotional support. So he always refused to discuss religion with us because his opinion was he would destroy, what we have, our nice little fantasies, I guess you could say. So he was never actively in opposition to our faith. And that used to trouble me in some ways when I was little because I had this idea that there was some big secret that he knew that I didn't know that would prove my faith incorrect. But as I went on through life and I sort of became older and asked him about it, I found out that there really wasn't any big reason that he wasn't a Christian. And that's what I've largely found out throughout life, even dealing with scientists. There's usually not some fact or some bit of knowledge that we're unaware of that disproves our whole Christian framework. It usually comes down to people are angry at God or can't comprehend some of what God has done. So the existential questions like why would God allow war, or why would God try to tell me what to do, or things of that nature. Those seem to be the main things that people have a hang up on, and it actually made me really grow in my faith and almost be relieved when I found out that he didn't have some big secret, to bring down our faith. But he always was very respectful. But that said, it does cause, like even now, he's not a Christian, and I said my husband isn't, so it does cause a bit of, I guess you could say, heartache in that you have to recognize that your family member is not a Christian, right? And so when they perish, they aren't going to be with you in heaven per se, right? So there is a constant need for prayer and pursuing that and witnessing to your family. But at the same time, you learn to accept and trust in God's judgment. You learn to give the people you love over to God, and He gets to judge, what's going to happen to them. And he's obviously a good God, right? He's merciful and just and loving and good. And so we can trust him with our family members, especially those that don't believe. And we can just trust that we just keep talking about Jesus, sharing the love of Jesus with them, being a light in the world, and let God do the rest.
I relate a lot in that way. I have some really good conversations with my dad, who is, I guess, agnostic for lack of a better term. And what you were saying there is kind of like been this sticking point, in that I'm trying to get in some of these arguments, for lack of a better term, but they're really good discussions, and they're really good for me too, because it's like a workout for your faith. But like getting them to see, like, actually, yeah, you're blaming God for a lot of things that people are doing. People make the choices to murder. People make the choices to rape and kill and do all these things and cause war. Like, people make those choices, and so you're blaming God for these choices that people are making. And it's trying to get them to see that, and that's the blinding part for a lot of people. But yeah, it's something that I think you can be part of God's mercy, essentially, being involved in the family. And I've never been a fan of people who completely shun their family away because they don't believe. You can obviously disapprove of someone's lifestyle or disapprove of and not support things in various ways, but always be present, because you never know if God is working through you to be that witness. You could be the thing, part of God's mercy, part of God's judgment, whatever. So God can say, hey, I've given you plenty of opportunities to hear the gospel. And I think it's important for people in these situations to always, remain faithful, trust in God. And there is a bit of that mourning aspect, I think, for a lot of people. But also, staying, persevering, I guess, and trusting that God uses each of us, in those situations.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I think there's, like you said, a difference between, kind of shunning someone and like shining the light of Christ. And you can hang out with people, but like that's not the same as like participating in like ungodly things. You know what I mean? Mm. So just shining that light of Christ with them, or to them.
Yeah, that's totally true. And I think one thing I've learned through this too is that the truth is the truth, no matter how many people believe in it or not. So even though most of my family and my friends, I would say, are non-believers, it doesn't make it true or not. It's not a democracy what is true, So being grounded in the truth and believing it for yourself, regardless of what other people think, I think is really important. Like the sky is blue whether everyone believes it or not. It's not going to change. The only thing that might change is the U.S. elections, but the sky is going to stay the same color.
I think the fact checkers at Snope would beg to disagree.
Fair comment.
So, growing up in Canada, you mentioned, I think you said, 20 years in martial arts?
Yeah, it was a long time. I started when I was 9 and I quit, I want to say, when I was probably maybe 32, 33, maybe 34, somewhere in there. So it was quite a large chunk of time.
What was the allure? Like, this fascinates me. Because, like, when I was younger, I did Taekwondo, and then I did straight up karate for years. I was a teenager, and it was budding into whatever social life I wanted, so I quit as a teenager. But, like, what was it that attracted you to that? What got you into that?
Originally, it was because my best friend, when I was 9, was the daughter of the head instructor of the school, so the owner of the school. And so that's how we originally got into doing it. And then once I was there, I guess there was a few things. It made me feel cool. So, anytime someone would ask me, what's your hobby? And I go, oh, I do Kung Fu. You get the, ooh, that's so cool. And you get a bit of the awe factor. And there was also the idea of learning to defend myself. So my parents were very supportive of me learning how to fight in case I was attacked in the street or a dark alley, when I'm out buying my Timmies, in Canada. But those are some of the allures. And then it builds a lot of confidence. So especially once you start getting into instructing. So I started teaching when I was a teenager. And so you learn to public speak, you learn to do demonstrations. It's somewhat empowering. And a lot of the things that you learn are skills that are quite valuable going on. So, for example, when I was teaching at the university there, uh, I had learned how to not be scared of talking in front of 30 people. I wasn't scared of doing that because I'd done that for years. And it also, there's tournaments. So there was a competitive aspect, and it sort of just became almost like a family. So you grow up with this same group of people, and they become very close to you. Like, we were training, when I quit there, we were there probably 5 or 6 days a week training and teaching. So you end up spending more time with these people than you spend with anyone else. And so you just grow really close. And that was part of what kept us there. It became our whole social network was connected to the school, and everything that you did was connected to the school somewhat, outside of your work. So you just end up getting invested, I guess, in the people and the relationships and the place, and it forms a big part of your identity. And the part of your identity that it forms tends to be popular with others. So you feel proud of it, and you feel that you can get some social capital for having those titles. Like if you show up and you say, I'm a black belt, right? You automatically are cooler than the math kid in the back of the class. So I think that was part of what kept us there for sure.
So that was a huge part of your life then, and you worked your way up through the ranks. And something that I had kind of wondered about, and this is how my mind works, because I only did it because I liked Jackie Chan movies and I liked Kung Fu movies. And so, but I never did Kung Fu. I never did anything those guys did, but it was something. But it did instill discipline. They had a program called the SWAT team, student working as a teacher, that you would do. And then, I was instructing classes and stuff like that. And I remember, and I can't do most of what I was able to do then, but I remember doing some very interesting things that in retrospect, I'm like, because we would do a lot of these things called katas, and there's just a series of movements in patterns. How well you did them is how you're judged. And some of these involved a lot of breathing exercises, followed by various movements. And then some of these katas would put you in a state where you feel invulnerable. And so what I mean is, like, through the breathing and through tensing and things, people could full on hit you, and it would bounce off, or you're not feeling it. And I thought, wow, that was amazing. But I had, after decades looking back, and before I even came to Christ, I dabbled in a bunch of different types of quote-unquote faiths, but Buddhism and Eastern stuff a lot. And I was trying to remember back, and I thought I remember hearing these Buddhist monks talk about some of the first martial artists, and that being developed through prayer and through chanting and through channeling this kind of information in whatever kind of tantric state they're in. And so I thought that was interesting. And I was kind of reflecting back at what may I have opened myself up to back then through the various things unknowingly. And realizing and looking around, and I was a punk teenage kid, and I literally dropped out right before becoming a black belt. And of course, so I didn't get why my family was like, "What the heck is the matter with you?" I'm like, "What, man? I don't want to do anymore, man." and I can only reflect on this in retrospect, like the elders or the people in the higher ranks and everything. They would get to points where like it just stopped being a belt system. They were wearing ropes and stuff, and they were doing other things. And looking back, I'm like, it becomes, you start to realize like it's a spiritual thing. Like you dedicate yourself, you go through all these things, and then the training is spiritual. Essentially, the more you grow in it, the more you realize you have to put your spirit into it, and then it becomes this spiritual discipline. And I got to thinking about how, with what all is involved, about how that really kind of conflicts with the things that Jesus preaches, the things that the Bible speaks about. And I'm just wondering if maybe you can get into a little bit of why you left that.
Yeah, you are right. It is. People try to decouple the physical versus the spiritual aspect of this. So especially when you start it out in martial arts, all the focus is on the physical. So you're learning how to block, you're learning how to punch, you're learning how to kick, you're doing sit-ups and push-ups, strengthening, stretching, all these things. And generally the focus is on the physical when you're in the color belts before you get to the black belt. And then once, at least at our school, once you became a black belt, you sort of got brought back into the kitchen and you sort of saw some of the back end of stuff. And it is a little bit spooky, but the scary thing is it's sort of a gradual transition. So it's not, they don't pop out of the back and say, come join our secret little society in the back where we're going to worship demons. It's not that overt. It's sort of a gradual introduction, like the pot is gradually heated up over time, and you're not necessarily even aware of it. Like, looking back, there was even blatant things like in our training studio. We originally started out in a school gym, and then over the years we raised money and we ended up getting our own school building, and it was all nice. But there was an altar in the training studio, and it had a statue of Guanggang, so the patron saint of Kung Fu. He was a Chinese general that was deified, and so you'd have a little statue of him, and there'd be incense and bowls of fruit on the altar, and it was to the side. It was on the side of the studio, and so you'd always be training, and that was the front of the studio, lots of times for the classes. And looking back, you see stuff like that, and you go, "What was I thinking? Why would I ever participate in something that has a blatant altar to essentially a demon, in reality?" But it's passed off as sort of a cultural thing, like, oh, this is just sort of our homage to Chinese culture, and all Kung Fu studios have an altar. It's meaningless. We know there's no actual Gong God. We just do this in honor of the Chinese. But when you think about that logically, especially as a Christian, if it's meaningless and there's no Guanggang, why are you bothering putting an altar up? Like, you don't need to honor the Chinese culture. So things like that, you're told these excuses, and it's easy to accept. Even just when you'd start out your classes, there is a bowing ceremony, right? And so you'd bow to each other, and essentially all the students would be bowing to the altar, because you're all, the students would face the instructor at the front of the class, and the altar's at the front of the class, but you don't actually think about it because, again, you're told, oh, this is just how it's done. We're learning discipline and respect, and we're paying respect to past masters, and we're paying respect to our current masters. And it's very easy to brush that stuff off and just accept it, especially when you're offered essentially the idea of becoming a little god, because that's essentially what you're offered when you do martial arts. You're offered these secrets to do fantastical physical things, and to get longevity in your life, and to have better health, and all these things. And essentially it's saying that you can become a little god on earth. You can become better than the common person. You can have faster reflexes. You can have better strength, better health, better confidence. You can defend yourself and your family, all these different things. And so it's easy for people to brush those things off. But as I said, when I became a black belt, you start getting brought back into the kitchen and you see more of the overt stuff. So, for example, I was brought on to the board to help test some of the black belts. And so the black belt test would be a full day affair. So you'd show up with the other instructors who were grading the candidates, and it would be a full day physical challenge. And so you'd take them through everything. They'd have to do, kicks till they puked. They'd do their forms till they died. Like, it was very intense. But it wasn't just a physical. They also had to write an essay saying, what has Kung Fu done for me? And at the ceremony of promotion, if they passed their exam, part of the process of getting your black belt was you had to stand up in front of the entire school and everyone and pontificate about what Kung Fu has done for me. And looking back, I sat through so many of those speeches, and I even wrote a speech myself when I became a black belt. And all the things that God has done, like all the blessings that God has given us, would be attributed to Kung Fu and the Kung Fu school. So people would say, like, oh, I had very poor health and now I'm in better health, or, oh, I had really bad family relations and now I know how to be better with my family, and like, I have healthy children now, and it would be, or people would be coming out of depression, or all these different things. And it was always glorifying Kung Fu and essentially glorifying ourselves and the head instructor, saying, look at how we're changing lives in the world and how great Kung Fu is, and everyone should join Kung Fu because it will change your life and make a difference in the world. And it's just, looking back, it's kind of horrifying to realize as a Christian that you're doing that. But at the time, you don't necessarily, it can be really hard, and it's easy to compartmentalize. So you go there and you do your thing with the ceremonies or the bowing to the altar, and then you leave and you go to church the next day, and there's not really, it can be hard unless God shows you, or unless he shows you with your Christian friends telling you this stuff. It can be really hard to realize that, no, you're not just doing this out of culture. You're not just doing this because it's always been done. It does have a sinister side, and it shouldn't be done. And I remember too, when we were part of so you do the public grading for your black belt, and you'd have a public ceremony, but there was also always a private ceremony. And the private ceremony was always done at night. So we would hang curtains in the windows of the school. We would close the school, and it would be dark out. You'd hang curtains so no one could see in. And only the black belts were allowed, and the candidates. And we would lay candles out in front of the altar in a row. There would be like a little brass bowl with some lighters, and there would be fresh fruit and fresh offerings put on the altar, and there would be some documents. And the candidates, you were required to make a banner representing yourself, and you would give it and hang it in front of the altar with all the other banners from all the other black belts, and they would only be hung up during that ceremony, and then they would be put away for the next year. So no one ever saw them except the people at the ceremony. And so we'd all line up all the black belts. You'd face away from the candidates by the candles in front of the altar, and the candidates would be brought out. And then we would end up doing some readings. So the readings were from Buddhist writings and things of that nature. And so each black belt would do a different reading. And then we'd also go through a burning ceremony. So they would take representatives of what it was to be a colored belt, and they would burn it in the little dish. And what that represented was they were no longer part of the color belt club, you could say, but they were now a black belt. And so there was a separation between black belts and color belts, and you don't really associate, and you're not supposed to tell the secrets of what we're doing to the color belt. So you're leaving your old social circles and you're joining the new social circles, and you do the burning ceremony, and then there would be a code of ethics, and we would all sign the code of ethics together at the front before the altar. And looking back, and especially like talking about it, it sounds super sketchy, these people gathering in the night around candles around an altar, doing readings and burning things. But at the time, you don't necessarily realize how incredibly ridiculous it is, right? You're drawn into this thing, and the explanation is you're trying to make it special for the black belts, the new black belts, and trying to give some sort of ceremony to their transition from the color belts to the black belts. And so as a Christian looking back, I can totally see the spiritual aspects to those things, but it's never admitted. No one ever comes and says, yes, we serve these demon gods, don't tell anybody, it's a secret. It's always explained away. And I think the closest I ever came to what the truth was when I actually finally quit. And part of the reason for my quitting was I started listening to the Omega Frequency podcast. And I remember sitting in my car and thinking to myself, I want to do everything for the glory of God. And I remember thinking, because I had to go teach, and I remember thinking, I don't think this glorifies God. And it was a really, I don't want to say silly, but it was a bit of a childish thought. But at the same time, that was the seed that sort of got me to break away out of that, because we were very involved there. Like we spent the majority of our time there. It was pretty much our whole lives, I would say. But that was the seed, like, does this actually glorify God? No, it doesn't. It's glorifying either myself or the head instructor, or, these Chinese gods. It's not bringing God any glory at all. So should I be wasting my time doing it? And the answer was no. Like, I shouldn't. If it's not bringing glory to God, why am I doing it? And that's where the question comes in. If you're a Christian, you want to serve God. And so sometimes you have to walk away from things like that if you come to the realization that it's not glorifying God. And so after that realization, I wrote my resignation letter, and I had to go deliver it off. And I remember going to the head instructor's office, and he had an office, and that was pretty much the only office. And we always used to joke about the fog in the office. And the reason we would joke about it, and it wasn't just me, it was everybody in the school. If you had a problem or you had some sort of issue and you went to go talk to the head instructor, it didn't matter how adamant you were or what line of thinking you had. When you went in there, by the time you came out, your point of view would be different. And you could never really remember what exactly was said to convince you otherwise. That was what the fog part was. But everybody knew when you went in there, whatever would happen when you came out, you would have a different point of view, and there would be some fuzziness in between. And I know that sounds a little weird and especially unscientific, but I don't know really how else to describe it. But I remember when I went to quit, that night I went into his office, and that was the only time I ever went in there and the fog was not present. And I remember talking to him, and he asked me, like, why are you quitting? And I said, I can't in good conscience teach children this stuff anymore. Because there was other stuff we were teaching, like chi manipulation, there was chi healing, there was all this gobbledygook stuff that we were involved in. And so I said, I can't in good conscience support this anymore. And my presence being here, even if I'm not spouting Buddhist beliefs, my presence adds validity to your school, and I don't want to be associated with this, and I don't want to support this anymore. I can't as a Christian. And I remember he did a couple things. He didn't really get angry, but he tried to tell me that I misunderstood the beliefs. So he tried to give me books to read, and I said no. He also said he offered me money to stay, and I said no. And he also said that I'm missing out a big opportunity to reach people, because he said I could talk to people in the change room about my faith if I want. I just can't talk about it on deck. And I said no, like I don't need that. And so he offered me money, offered me influence, and I declined, and I said no, I can't in good conscience. And I told him, like, I believe in Jesus and I follow Jesus, and I can't. And what was interesting was he said to me, well, I talk to Jesus too, and Jesus has talked to me, and what I'm doing here is fine. And I remember saying, I don't think you're talking to Jesus. And that's when I got up and left, and I never have set foot again in that school since then. But that was the only time that the fog wasn't present, and I felt clear-headed, and I felt strong in my opinions and my beliefs. Now, whether or not that has any, the fog was a spiritual thing or not, there definitely was spiritual influences there. And it was by the grace of God that I was able to leave, because it was very cultish, I guess you could say, there. But you are right. There is a complete spiritual attachment. And that's what the danger is, because I know lots of Christian friends that are considering putting their kids in martial arts because they view it as just a physical activity. You know, their kid will learn discipline, their kid will learn to defend themselves, their kid will learn confidence, which, yes, they probably will, but you can't decouple the reason why you do the movements from the movements. So you may learn to kick and punch, but the reasoning behind it and why those motions are put together the way they are is fundamentally based on spiritual reasons or philosophical reasons. And so you can't really decouple that. And so I think there's a huge danger there. And I'm always weary, just like yoga, you know, you hear Christian yoga. I've heard of Christian martial arts, and I have a really hard time buying that, because the motivations and the whole driving force behind the whole activity is spiritual in nature and philosophical in nature. And you can't decouple those things, you know?
Yeah, when you was talking about that, it just kind of it made me think about, you know, just being an outsider, because I've never did martial arts at all. But hearing like you describe it, it does seem like a ritual, you know, like ritualistic things. And then also the movements, like you were talking about when you said that. I was thinking of yoga, and then you mentioned yoga, because, you know, in the beginning of my walk, I used to do yoga. And when I like defended it and stuff and was like, no, it's just stretching and all this stuff. But then once, you know, I listened to somebody and they were explaining how like each move means something, and it's like an
act of worship or something.
Yeah, an act of worship to like different deity, you know, quote unquote deities of Hinduism. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, here I'm doing that. And then luckily I never like did Kundalini yoga or anything like that. But I just thought that, oh no, this is fine. It's okay. It's not like anything. But then once I looked into it, I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, it actually is something. And then I've tried to like talk to people about it, and there are Christians who are like, if you mention anything about that, they just like their claws come out. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. And again, it's kind of, I think part of it is there's this idea here that we still live in a Christian culture. So I remember growing up and reading the Bible, you know, how it talked about Elijah and the prophets of Baal, or you know, the pagan temples that Paul had to deal with, you know, things like that. And I remember thinking, I'm so glad that we don't have to deal with that stuff anymore. You know, I'm so glad I live here where there's churches everywhere. And so I think there's always this concept that that stuff couldn't be bad because it's here and we're in a Christian society, you know, and I think there's a bit of ignorance there, and people don't necessarily want to go into it too much, because then you have to start recognizing all the other pagan stuff going on in our society, you know, like in our media and, you know, all our books and schools and everything, that we're not necessarily as Christian of a society as we'd like to think. And you do have to take some responsibility and evaluate critically what you're getting involved in, like martial arts, you know. And I think a big issue with that there is part of the idea of how you generate the motions and you know, how you fit things together when you're doing them has to do with the idea of chi. And you're not necessarily told that right off the bat. You're not told the motivations behind how all these moves connect. But it comes down to these spiritual beliefs, you know, like chi is the idea that you have this internal energy and it can be manipulated. And once you get higher up, it even gets to the point where you can like fight people with your chi. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's kind of like the Dragon Ball Z. I don't know if you remember that cartoon,
yes.
but
I was like, I don't know, I see that anime all the time. Yeah.
yeah. And, you know, it got to the point where people were practicing trying to attack each other with these things. And like, I remember, like, some of it is ridiculous. Like, some of it is untrue and fake, but some of it it is true. Like there is that aspect where people can generate power, but it's not from God. It's not a godly power. And part of the reason you know that is because the motivation is to become godlikely. You're trying to get power for yourself. You're not glorifying God. And I remember we were training. This was towards when we were getting ready to leave. And we were watching YouTube videos, and there was this rather rotund martial arts instructor who was older, and he was trying to demonstrate these chi attacks that you could do, and he had this crowd of people, and he would go ha, and he would push his hand into the air, and there was a gap between him and the people in front of him, and they would all fall down in this dramatical way, and he would be like, see, and he was doing all these things, and it was all very fake looking, because there's a lot of fakery that goes on. And I remember he said, the best way to stop these chi attacks is if you put your tongue to the roof of your mouth and cross your toes. And we just laughed because we thought it was just the most ridiculous thing we've ever heard. But then we were at school for the black belt class that week, and our instructor, he goes to tell us, like we were working on chi and trying to do these, not the same dramatical things, but trying to manipulate our opponent with our chi, just by our movements and trying to put them off guard and things like that. And he came up with a comment, like, oh, put the tongue to your roof of your mouth and cross your toes, and then this won't work on you. I've tried it and it works. And you just realize how much of what's going on is built on lies and just ridiculousness. And it's just such a sad thing, because there's so many people, like I myself bought into a lot of this stuff, and you just adamantly believe it, and it's absolutely true. But when you pull out of it and you step back and you realize just how full of lies it is, it's just so heartbreaking to see the people involved. Like we had a special elite class in the school that was all the elite students, and the reason I say it's kind of cult-like is there was a lot of encouragement to be insular in the community. So not necessarily to go out of the community, but to stay in the community, and you wanted to be part of the elite inner circles of that community. And there was an example of a man who was in that elite student program, and his wife had just had a baby like 3 days before, and we show up to train at the school, and he's out there picking weeds around the school. And so we asked him, we're like, why are you here? What are you doing picking weeds? You should be at home with your new baby. Like, what's going on? And he's like, oh no, I have to do this for the instructor. I have to do this for Sifu. This is too important. Sifu needs to have no weeds at the school. And, a normal person would look at that and be like, no, your priorities are completely wrong. You should be at home with your newborn. But when you're in that, it's just so twisted. And I think that's the danger of like Satan and especially paganism and things like that, is it slowly draws you in and just warps your understanding of what your priorities should be completely. And you don't even necessarily realize it. And that's the tragedy, I think.
As you were talking, I was just starting to connect some dots. And whether, now when I mentioned the same spirit, whether it's spirit or figurative spirit, I've seen the video of the old guy, the old heavyset guy is, knocking people down with his chi power, and they're falling, and I saw the reporter doing it, and nothing happened with him because he's like, try it on me, and like nothing happens. And I was immediately, as you were talking about, I was thinking about who does kind of like the same thing, like Benny Hill or whatever, swinging his jacket around.
Benny Hinn, whoever.
Yeah, but it's the same thing.
Swinging their jacket around, the crowd's falling down, and they're reaching their hands out, and people are falling back. I'm like, it seems like the same spirit. And I've got a theory. I've got a theory, Tiffany. I want you to tell me if I'm right on the money here. This is my theory.
Okay.
All right. So martial arts and things like that. Now, I don't know if you studied any, like, about the origin of martial arts, because I'm just going off of memory. And what I think I remember is like this monk talking about some of these things were channeled through the monks and the Buddhist monks and through their tantric meditation. And I was thinking about however much credit people want to give to the Book of Enoch, it talks about the fallen angels. and it talks about their influence on mankind. You get a kind of bigger picture of this heavenly family and a bigger picture of angels in general, and the idea that they have jobs, that they have functions and things. And one of the corrupting things that some of the fallen angelic hosts did was teach mankind the art of warfare. And I'm wondering, because like angels have swords, angels have some sort of, they've got hierarchy and all of these things. And so are we imitating heavenly warfare? Are we imitating? Is this the product of the fallen angels and using their art of warfare? And you hear, and this is how, maybe this is going to show that I'm still a 16-year-old boy in a 30-some-odd-year-old man's body. But like, you read about battles between angels, right? You read in Revelation, and in my mind, I'm thinking, what in the world? Like, how does that look? What the heck? And like, no, they can't die, either of them. So what's happening? And I think I talked to BDK about this. I'm like, do you think they're like kung fu fighting each other sometimes? Like, is this what do you think's going on there? I have no idea what that would be like. But like, I'm thinking, this is channeled fallen angelic warfare, essentially. I mean, because there's an art of defense, but you learn the attack and the opposition of what Jesus says, turn the other cheek. And so like, and I'm always thinking about that John Chris guy is telling that joke of like, I got people that come up and ask me to, want me to pray, and then so-and-so asked me to pray for their karate tournament, and like, how am I supposed to pray for that? Like, okay, help, yes, Lord, help Jenny here kick, the other kid in the face harder. Like, so like, it's just interesting how how people or Christians or whatever kind of rectify, because like the root issue is the root cause, or like you're putting out a punch to inflict some kind of damage, whether it be defense or attack. There's a root to that, and some type of energy has to go into that. And so Jesus is all about addressing the root. But like the fact of where this stuff comes from, I'm thinking, hey, this is some fallen angelic techniques here. What do you think?
Well, it is true, I would say, about the channeling stuff. Like, for instance, we were doing meditation, and the goal of the meditation was to empty your mind completely and be open to sort of the universe, I guess you could say. And so there's definitely that aspect where there's this idea that there's virtue in being able to accept outside influence, I guess, on your psyche. So that I would think is true. In regards to whether or not it's fallen angel, teaching them, I wouldn't necessarily know what to say about that. Accepting that the very idea, like the whole point of martial arts, is that you can take care of yourself. You don't need anybody else. You can become as strong as you need to be. You can become as fast as you need to be. You can make it so that you can fix any problem that you're facing. And that's sort of the goal of being a martial artist, is that you become the person that you need. So you don't need God anymore, because you can defend yourself. You can fight for yourself, and you can beat your opponents yourself, even if your opponents aren't physical. Like that was always talked about, even obstacles in your life, like your work or your family life. If you apply these principles to your life at large, you can solve your problems yourself, and everyone will love you and think you're cool. And so I think that's the link there, because I think all the demonic and all the fallen angels, their goal is to turn our focus from God and take our reliance off of God and try to get us to rely on ourselves and focus on ourselves. Just like Eve in the garden, eat this fruit and you can be as God. You don't need God anymore. And so I think that's a huge connection there. But I mean, I'm sure they do kung fu fight, but I've never seen it, so I couldn't say.
Well, because I'm a man child, of course. I think about these things.
I'm not judging. No judgment.
Judge me by my fruit. If so, I stay somewhat as much as I can with working full time and having a family and doing ministry things. Stay up on some pop culture things, and so like I just see an overarching message. And some movies, television shows, whatever, that glorified this stuff that have continued on. I mean, some of these characters are now quote unquote gods in their little in their stories, and so it's just very interesting that the correlation there, you know, an ascendance to godhood, and that I mean goes to what is it, Genesis 3? I mean, one of the first lies told by the enemy: you will be like God, right? You won't die. You will be like God, and it's in most religions, you know, the human ascending to godhood in some way. And, you know, that's what led some of the angels to fall, is accepting that worship, accepting the appreciation, accepting the things that were supposed to go to God. And so a lot of what is being taught today in the world, do what thy wilt, essentially, you know, this Crowley, do what thy wilt, be the whole of the law, that's essentially the message the world shoves down your throats. And Christ is diametrically opposed to that. And it's about emptying yourself and having humility, taking up your cross and dying daily and being completely and totally dependent and reliant upon God. And that's so against what you're taught, especially in the Western world. And I know a lot of Eastern, like India and China or something, they're taught to value material things, value your position in life. They've got a caste system, you know. That's why they value education more than a lot of us over here, and seek a position. You know, those things are valued because they don't have, you know, God, essentially, the gospel. And that's such a huge, again, everything that the world shoves down your throat is completely and diametrically opposed to what Jesus speaks about. You know, they'll tell you to follow your heart, follow your dreams, follow your will, follow your desires. And then nowhere in any of that. It sounds great and it sounds wonderful, and you can go on to do and accomplish many great things. God designed every person with a spark of creativity in some form, some fashion, some way. And it's sad that a lot of people don't use that to glorify God, but most people don't. And they can go on and they can achieve incredible things, do incredible feats, and God was nowhere a part of that. And how much more could have been if they were using that to glorify God. And God is not in the picture for a lot of people, and a lot of, again, just what the world preaches. It's about self and the ascendance, essentially, to godhood.
Yeah, no, it's totally true. And I think the sad part of that is people don't recognize what a lie that is. Like, when we were doing training, you'd learn to do some pretty amazing things that would impress other people. But if you looked at the martial arts community as a whole, there was something called the Master's Curse that was sort of talked about. And what that was you could reach a certain physical prowess, but naturally your body degrades over time. And so there would be a certain point in your life where you were no longer at your peak and you would be in decline. And that always proved to be a sort of an existential crisis for martial artists, at least especially Western ones. Chinese ones I can't really speak to because they had a bit of a different philosophy. But at least in our circles here in the West, it would always be a hard transition because you'd have someone that had built their whole identity about being the physical best at something and being able to physically beat anyone else. And all of a sudden their body starts failing them, you know, like hip replacements, knee replacements, just loss of muscle mass, decrease in healing time, things like that. Your speed decreases. All these different things happen to you, and you cannot do anything to stop it. And that's proved very crushing for many martial artists because their whole identity is built upon their physicality, and it's challenging to accept that failing, and there's nothing they can do about it. And there's been a few, like there was one associated in our lineage. So the lineage would be sort of where your master learned from his master, from his master, from his master. So you'd have this lineage of masters. And one of the ones that founded our style here in the West, he actually, when he hit this existential crisis, he stopped training and went and started a religion in British Columbia. There, he built himself a temple, and he named himself the high priest of whatever. I can't remember the name of the religion he started, but it's not uncommon. He's not the only one. So even if you look at some of the celebrity martial artists, they've also turned very religious at the end, so they become priests or whatever. Like Steven Seagal, if you look at him, for example, he's become the priest. I can't remember which religion, but he's become a priest also of a religion. And he in BC, I think he's made some visits to a temple there. But there's sort of this crisis where this lie is revealed that you cannot attain this godhood yourself. Your body will fail, but that's not told to you at the start. You feel invincible and you feel like your youth will last forever. But it inevitably hits everybody, and it's challenging for them. And then you can see the roots of that lie come forth when they sort of start their own religions, or they go and join some priesthood for Buddhism or something like that. That's when sort of the spiritual roots come out. But it's still very sad because it's showing Satan's lie. Like, you cannot be a god. You cannot solve all your problems yourself. Your body's going to fail and you will die. So I guess that would be the sad part of it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And one of the things that, as I'm learning, the older I get, I'm starting. So, I mean, after martial arts, I just, one thing I always cap up in is like weight training and stuff like that. And one thing that's been humbling for me is noticing some changes, noticing that, being more sore the next day, being a little bit slower, and noticing this like in mid-30s. I'm like, wow. And looking around, there's lots of people in fitness, and they're presenting an image that, again, and I had to learn all this stuff. They're presenting an image with almost comic book like looking, and I'm like, how in the heck, how in the world is this? And they'd be even older and not understanding. So a lot of these people who rely on physical prowess and everything and want a immortality essentially turn to, well, they'll do spiritual, but I mean also with like drugs, they'll lean towards drugs, right? So there's a lot of, I knew about steroids, but I just thought steroids were steroids. I didn't know there's like hundreds of different kinds of steroids that do various types of things for men and women. And all of a sudden, you have these people who look like comic book heroes. And as I kind of still pay attention to all this stuff, I'm noticing a lot of them are starting to drop like flies, even though they look like the peak of like human, like Adonis type. And they're dropping like flies, and it's, I didn't really, they're all on all this gear. They're on all these different types of cycles of drugs to prolong whatever. And it's insanely unnatural, right, for the human body to even look like how a lot of people are looking these days. And it's unnatural to force all these different hormones and things in the body. But people are willing to sacrifice that to stay on top, especially when they have their careers. Their careers are this, especially with like money and things like that are involved. And it's interesting, back when you're talking about when you went into the office of the head guy there, into the quote unquote fog, the things that he kind of tempted you with were like along the same lines that Satan tempted Jesus with in the wilderness.
I was just thinking that. When she was talking about it, I was thinking that. So it's crazy that you touched on that.
I wanted to, because like,
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels, and it is kind of spooky, but like when you talk about the drugs, Satan's lies lead to more lies and lead to more sin, right? So when you look at people's with drug use, and it happens in the martial arts too, especially in the tournament scene, it's not really talked about, but it Satan's lies leads to sin, leads to more sin, and always draws you down, and it's always sort of an incremental thing, like the Bible verse, don't give Satan a foothold, because once he gets a foothold, then he'll put another foot. And it's just inch by inch, your path can be changed to the wrong direction, and you get off the narrow way and you don't even necessarily realize it because it's not a sudden drastic thing where you wake up one day and say, you know what I want to be? I want to be a roid monkey when I grow up. It's sort of a gradual transition, but you're totally right. In that regard, and I agree with you with the parallels with Jesus' temptations. I think Satan has certain MOs that God put in the Bible to sort of give us a heads up to judge these things.
Yeah, and with all the deception and darkness out there, we just have to be more vigilant. And I think we need to study our word more and understand. And I think that was a big thing for me in faith, was trying to answer or understand what it is I say I believe. And I wonder if people are asking that question. What is it I actually believe? What does it mean to believe the way I believe?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it takes a certain amount of evaluation and acceptance of living your faith. And I remember before I left, I would say, oh, yes, I'm a Christian, but I was sort of a couch Christian. And the reason I say that is it didn't cost me anything. I didn't have to give up anything or make any hard choices to keep my faith. And I think if you truly want to walk with Jesus, it costs you something. You're supposed to carry your cross and follow him. And so when you critically evaluate how you live your life, who you spend your time with, what you put your money into, what are you doing in your spare time? What are you watching on TV? Are those Christ honoring things? And if they're not, just like Jesus said, it's better to enter into heaven maimed than it is to go to hell with all your members. You need to get those things out of your life. And that's where it sort of, for me, was living my faith, was actually making decisions on what I would do in my life based on Christ and his teachings and not what I wanted.
All right, and that concludes this week's episode with Tiffany. Come back next week where we talk more about geology and if the study of geology has made Tiffany question her faith, or has it built her faith? Grace and peace.